Hi everyone, welcome back to another genre comparison video. This time it's going to be a little bit different. We're going to do progressive rock versus grunge. And it's going to follow a similar trend to my metal ones, the previous ones that I've done. I'm going to change it up a little bit because I'm going to use my tablet as the script instead of reading it off my laptop. Also, before we get into the video, please subscribe if you're new and check out the playlists on the channel, and if you go on to like this video, drop it a like. Anyway, right, let's just get straight into it. Right, progressive rock. Sometimes it's shortened to prog rock. It's a very broad style of rock music that developed in the late 1960s. It incorporates different styles of music including psychedelic rock, blues rock, folk, jazz and classical music. It focuses deeply on musical and compositional complexity rather than more pop sounding melodies. Artists would experiment with unique sounds and new musical technology to get revolutionary sounds and progressions. Also, drummers would use a variety of techniques and time signatures. It is seen as an art form, and it is incredibly sophisticated and is often known as art rock. The main origin is in the UK. Lyrically, prog usually takes inspiration from a lot of poetry, and subject matters can be anything really, from social, political, mental, scientific, sci-fi stuff as well. Now we're going to go into a brief history of the genre. It began specifically in 1966 when bands such as the Beatles, the Beach Boys and the Byrds were massively experimenting with sounds and different styles. And then came the rise of Bob Dylan, The Who and the Yardbirds, all with a slightly different sound and trying out different things as well. This all led to the beginning of the genre of progressive rock. After this, bands came through and had a massive influence on the prog movement, including The Doors, The Pretty Things, The Zombies, Steppenwolf and The Grateful Dead. This allowed the first line of prog bands to emerge in 1968, including Pink Floyd, King Crimson, Jethro Tull, Yes, Genesis, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, or otherwise known as ELP, Van der Graaf Generator, Gentle Giant and Renaissance. However, it was only in the early 1970s where the genre gained mass popularity and peaked during 71 and 76, with Jethro Tull, Yes, ELP, Rush and Pink Floyd all dominating the decade with multiple chart-topping albums. 16 of their albums combined reaching the top 10 in that time, including Aqualung, Thick as a Brick and War Child for Jethro Tull, the Yes album Fragile and Close to the Edge for Yes, the self-titled Fly By Night and 2112 for Rush, Pictures in an Exhibition, Trilogy and Brain Salad Surgery for ELP, and Obscured by Clouds, The Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here for Pink Floyd. Also, Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells was used for the theme for The Exorcist and also has sold over 16 million copies. The genre was very popular in the UK and Europe, and it began to gain popularity in North America mainly due to the success of the Canadian band Rush, and other bands emerging such as Starcastle, Captain Beyond and Frank Zappa. Then bands such as Kansas, Boston and Six started to combine more hard rock and early heavy metal elements into their progressive sound, though it was way more successful in Europe than in the States. After this, however, in the late 70s, the genre declined due to the rise of punk rock. Prog rock was made to look unfashionable, and some bands like Yes and ELP went on hiatus. Other bands such as Van der Graaf Generator and Gentle Giant were dissolved by the start of the 80s. This was due to record labels giving artists less freedom to experiment and create progressive melodies, instead pursuing them to appeal to the mainstream media, which many prog musicians disliked very much. Jethro Tull and Pink Floyd changed their sound slightly to more of a hard rock sound in order to stay relevant, though Pink Floyd pretty much was ended in the 80s as well. Newer progressive rock bands did emerge in the 80s, but with more of a symphonic pop sound. These bands included Supertramp, 10cc, the Alan Parsons Project, and Electric Light Orchestra, otherwise known as ELO. Some European guitarists started to use prog rock elements in their heavy metal music and laid the foundation for progressive metal. These included Michael Schenker of UFO and Udi John Roth of the Scorpions. There also were relative success for bands such as Journey, GTR and Foreigner. In the 90s there was a resurgence of progressive rock bands. They used the template from the 70s bands and some 80s inspired riffs and guitar solos. These include the Flower Kings, Spock's Beard and Glass Hammer. Since then, progressive music has diverged into many different subgenres. The main subgenre that developed was neo-progressive rock. This came to be in the early 80s and was influenced by funk, hard rock, punk rock, and Peter Gabriel era Genesis was also a big inspiration. The genre is largely keyboard-based bands with extended compositions with complex musical and lyrical structures. Bands of this genre include Marillion, Saga, IQ, Pendragon, and Palace. Another big subgenre that was created is progressive metal. The genre first came to be in the late 1980s and fuses different styles of metal music with prog rock. There are elements of progressive metal in black metal and in other subgenres such as symphonic metal, neoclassical metal, power metal, and avant-garde metal. Bands of this genre include Dream Theater, Queensryche, Voivod, Tool, Mastodon, Symphony X, Mudvayne, Opeth, and Gojira. Other subgenres include post-progressive, new prog, avant prog, progressive folk, art music, proto-prog, and progressive pop. Now we're going to move on to grunge. Grunge is a genre of alternative rock that was huge in the early to mid 1990s. Its origin is the United States, but more specifically Seattle. Its influences include punk rock, hard rock, heavy metal, hardcore punk, alternative and indie rock, but more specifically the indie band Sonic Youth. Traits usually include loud distorted down-tuned guitars, power chords, simple guitar solos with feedback noise, layered power chords for the bass, and simple drum setup with simple drum beats. Vocal styles include gravelly, raspy vocals, growls, moans, screams, and mumbles. Lyrical themes include social alienation, self-doubt, abuse, negligence, betrayal, social and emotional isolation, physical trauma, and a desire for freedom. Let's just get into a brief history of the genre. In the mid to late 80s, many bands were being loosely known as proto-grunge. Earliest proto-grunge album was in 1965 called Here Are the Sonics by the Sonics. Also, Neil Young and Elvis Costello had albums in the 70s and the 80s that are also considered proto-grunge. The band Green River is considered to have made the first grunge record in 1985 with Come On Down. Also, a compilation album featuring 6 local grunge bands including Green River, Soundgarden, Melvins, Malfunction, Skinyard and the U-Men was released and considered another early step for the grunge movement in 1986. At this stage, grunge was incredibly underground, but in Seattle it was growing very, very quickly. Also in the late 80s, there was a quick rise of grunge bands in Australia, with bands such as The Scientists, X, Feed Time, and Cosmic Psychos coming through and becoming big influences for the Seattle grunge bands. It began to reach the mainstream success in the latter years of the 1980s, with bands such as Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Screaming Trees, and Nirvana all signing big record labels and releasing their debut albums between 88 and 1990. However, it was in 1991 when Nirvana released their revolutionary album Nevermind. You might have heard of it. This was an instant success on MTV and was certified gold within 8 weeks upon the release. And it was the album that pretty much allowed grunge to be the main genre of rock for the next few years. None could really rival the impact of that album when it came out. The band Pearl Jam released their debut album 10 a month before, and it didn't do as well, but when Nevermind was released, it really quickly became a very successful album. Soundgarden and Alice in Chains released their third and second albums respectively in 1992 as the grunge genre grew even more. Also, the band Temple of the Dogs released their self-titled album, which was a collaboration between Pearl Jam and Alice in Chains members. It was also released in 92 and was very commercially successful. The Seattle grunge sound became the main vocal point for the genre after this. Over the next few years, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, and Alice in Chains all released massively commercially successful albums. Also, the band Candlebox released their self-titled album in 1993 and was certified 4 times platinum. This paved the way for other grunge bands to come through, including Stone Temple Pilots, the most successful band out of these going to be listed, Trippin' Daisy, Toadies, Paw, and Veruca Salt, and Australian band Silverchair. Also, Nickelback's debut album Curd is also considered as a grunge album. And British band Bush released their debut album 16 Stone in 1994, considered as a direct copy of Nirvana's sound, however. After this, the genre began to decline due to many factors. Firstly, the musicians were increasingly having terrible drug addictions. By the mid-90s, most grunge bands had broke up or become less prominent in the commercial eye. Another reason was in 1994 when Kurt Cobain was found dead in his home after suspected suicide. Nirvana broke up and that pretty much was the end of grunge after that. Dave Grohl went on to form the Foo Fighters, switching from drums to guitar and vocals as you do. Also, Alice in Chains vocalist Lane Staley died of drug overdose in 2002, which pretty much prematurely ended that band. Screaming Trees and Soundgarden released albums in 1996, before the latter broke up in 97. Lastly, the emergence of Britpop bands such as Blur and Oasis ended the grunge dominance. Until in the mid-2000s, when grunge made a really great comeback due to the post-grunge phase, which we'll get onto in a minute, and the classic grunge bands reforming and making music again. The most successful out of these were Pearl Jam, releasing several albums over the last 15 years. Alice in Chains reformed in 2005 and appointed William Duvall on vocals. They have also released a few albums since reforming with this new lineup. And Soundgarden reformed as well in 2010 and released King Animal in 2012, and they toured up until Chris Cornell sadly passed away in 2017. As well as this, in the 2000s and 2010s, there was an uproar of bands labelled to have a massive grunge influence. These bands included Wolf Alice, Yuck, The Cut, Sloth Rust, Red Sun Rising, Code Orange, Fan Club, and My Ticket Home. The only subgenre of grunge that I could find was post-grunge. And post-grunge is a lighter, less heavy version of grunge with better production quality, fit for just continuous radio play on Kerrang. It began in the mid to late 90s when the original grunge movement was coming to an end. The music was way more accessible for audiences, which provided the genre to be really, really successful. Bands of this genre include Nickelback, Candlebox, Bush, Foo Fighters, Puddle of Mudd, Creed, Alter Bridge, Black Stone Cherry, Stone Sour, Audio Slave, and many, many others. Also, grunge was a massive part in creating genres such as nu metal, alternative metal, and stoner rock. Right, so now we're going to get into the similarities and the differences of the two genres. First, the similarities. They both revolutionised the sound of rock music, incorporating different melodies and progressions. Yeah, at the time, in both circumstances, there wasn't a sound like what those bands were making at the time, so yeah. They were both the most popular genre of rock music at the time. Yeah, back in its heyday, progressive rock was everywhere. The same with grunge. Grunge was everywhere on MTV in the 90s. Both genres explored the boundaries and absolutely smashed through them. Yeah, the ideas and the progressions were so unique and innovative. Yep, they were both a massive phase in music, which was over in a few years. Yeah, that's what happens with trends. They last for a very few years at most, and then they just die. They both have a very strong identity that changed the way people looked and saw themselves. Yeah, progressive rock people were very, very sophisticated and articulate, and they had a whole new different way of dressing and looking and speaking. And it's the same with grunge, really. They had a very particular way how they looked and, you know, how they acted and how they dressed. So yeah, and the lyrical themes are pretty similar in some areas, yeah. Now on to the differences. The fashion and culture are completely polars apart from each other. That's what I just said. That the progressive rock guys were really sophisticated and very well educated and dressed really smart, and the grunge guys just had a dirty t-shirt on and a dirty flannel shirt on and dirty jeans and old Dr. Martin boots and sitting there having a fag, and they couldn't really give a crap. Musically, totally different in terms of structure, progressions, and instrumentation at times. Yeah, you can definitely tell a grunge song when you hear it and a progressive rock song when you hear it, and they are completely different in those terms. The vocal styles are way different, yeah, no kidding. Very kind of gruffy sounding vocals in grunge, and in progressive rock they're mainly just sort of almost spoke at times, the vocals, or they're just very lightly spoken. There are less guitar solos in grunge. Yeah, there's more guitar solos in... Actually, there's probably just more solos in general, whether it be a keyboard or a guitar solo in progressive music. In grunge, they didn't really care too much about guitar solos, maybe apart from Alice in Chains and Soundgarden. They had quite a few guitar solos, but say Nirvana, Kurt Cobain didn't really do much in terms of guitar solos. There's not a lot of distortion in prog rock, and other effects. In terms of other effects, they're quite similar. Yeah, they do use a lot of effects, but some of the effects they use are very different. They don't tend to use a lot of distortion in prog rock. Maybe like a fuzz pedal or something to up the wall of sound that they have. But for grunge, it's, you know, they have a slightly different sort of effects kit that they use, but they still use a lot of effects. And lastly, prog rock production quality is way better than grunge. Grunge, they didn't really care how it sounded, just as long as they can get it all down. But prog rock were probably, they used to spend hours and lots of money on getting it to sound really, really great. Right, so now we're going to move into my final thoughts on both genres. I don't hate prog rock. It's certainly not my favourite genre of rock. I'm not a big fan of how the musicians, like how they present themselves as being a bit arrogant and they think they're better than everyone else. I don't really like that. I don't mind some of the music. I like Rush a lot, and I don't mind some Pink Floyd stuff. Even though I don't think Dave Gilmour's that great of a guitar player. I think he's the most overrated guitarist of all time. Don't kill me for saying that. But the rest of it I haven't really gotten into much. It's just a genre that I can't get into very well. Although the innovation of the music is absolutely mind-blowing for me. As no one was playing that kind of music at the time. No one even thought to create progressions like what they were creating. And the influence on the 80s and 90s band is definitely unquestioned, creating the path for progressive metal, which I actually prefer massively to prog rock. The musicianship is incredible, the songwriting is interesting, the legacy of the genre will live on for many decades to come. But it just ain't my cup of tea, sorry. But out of the two, I much prefer grunge. The whole scene in the 90s is massively relatable to somebody like myself. You know, the look, the attitude, the music is just simply allowing the music to let everything loose. And, you know, they never hold back. They don't care what you think of them, and, you know, they have that punk attitude, which is really cool. The progressions and the riffs are massively different compared to other types of music at the time. Alice in Chains and Soundgarden are two of the most revered bands of the 21st century. Yeah, I still got to listen to some of their stuff, but I promise I will. I promise I will. Because I actually really, really like them bands. I'm actually not a massive fan of Nirvana though, although I have a massive respect for Kurt Cobain as he's a fellow lefty. But I'm not a massive fan of Nirvana's music. I like a couple of songs, but that's about it. Its influence and legacy is arguably even greater than prog, with bands of all rock and metal music, you know, having a massive inspiration from grunge music. And yeah, I know it may have ended quite a lot of music scenes from the 80s, but it has created an even better future for rock and metal music, being part of the foundation for what we have today. And there it is, my comparison video of prog and grunge. Let me know what your favourite genres out of the two are and what you think of these genres. I'd love to know what you think. Any feedback on this video is much appreciated. I hope to see you in the next one. Until then, keep it rock.